For centuries, it served as the central hub for religious and cultural activities within the Jewish faith and remains an integral part of Jewish life today. Yes, it's the synagogue here in our historic capital city of Bridgetown. In fact, the entire compound is a sacred space, and here you will find not only the synagogue, but a museum and, of course, the mikveh bathhouse. Welcome to Monuments. I'm Rashid Best. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the study of archaeology, Barbadians and visitors from around the world are today experiencing and interacting with the many artifacts and viewing one of the wonders of this historic capital city, which will be later revealed in the program. In March of 2009, Dr. Carl Watson oversaw an archaeological excavation and study of the Synagogue Historic District, which unearthed many artifacts. He begins the program by explaining the process of his research.
Okay, here we are in one of the graveyards of the Jewish synagogue. And this exercise being conducted is really a field exercise in historical archaeology. I'm accompanied with my PhD candidate and archaeologist Michael Stoner and students from the University of the West Indies and Michael's assistant, Mr. Johnson. What we're doing here is we are doing 2 trial trench excavations along what was one of the original entrances to the synagogue. Bearing in mind that this was an Orthodox Sephardic community, men would have entered from this gate and women would have entered from the other side of the synagogue because men and women were separated during service. Now, as the documents would indicate, and certainly the archaeology tends to confirm, this synagogue, this yard, was developed sometime in the period starting about 1654 and on through. There were modifications over time, and that's the purpose of the archaeology, to understand when and how the modifications took place. And in fact, in the trenches that we have excavated here, we've discovered a number of interesting features. This is part of what archaeology seeks to explain. When human interaction occurs with the physical landscape, it creates things at last that archaeologists call features, whether it be a stone wall, as you can see here, whether, if I don't know whether the camera can focus on it, but the marl floor that lies about 1.5 feet under the surface, something that is ubiquitous in Bridgetown, because wherever Michael Stone and I have excavated in Bridgetown, we discover this rammed marl floor, and under it, that acts as a seal. And again, this is one of the things that archaeology depends on. Context and the levels or layers that are deposited over time through largely human activity. And the marl floor acts as a seal that provides, as it were, a time capsule, because once you break through that seal, you enter then an undisturbed context. And again, if you were to focus, use the camera to focus, you can see here it's been neatly brushed and a number of artifacts are exposed. And just from the surface here, I can see a piece of blue and white delft. I see a large fragment of a conch shell. And remember, conch was utilized as a food source. Barbadian redware. I can see a piece of a smoking pipe. So that's what archaeology is really all about. The recovery of garbage, basically, that's what it is. It is garbage from the past, but it's garbage that reflects social, economic, and cultural activity. So in gathering that garbage together in a controlled excavation, one can then, especially for historical archaeology, flesh out what the documents do not necessarily say. So, with that little interruption from a street character, let us proceed. Michael, now, you pointed out a very interesting feature here. Would you like to come and comment on this particular feature? Here you go. Here's your mic.
Well, as we were excavating here, we encountered a marl floor, as Dr. Watson already talked about. But once we got underneath the marl floor, we had a layer of rubble, but then it turned into what appears to be some kind of stone. Oh, I don't know what it is. It could be a stone floor, a stone path. It could be a fallen over wall, for all we know. But I mean, it's hard to understand until you start excavating that landscapes change over time, and whatever landscape was here before, well, as it is now, everybody sees this and says, oh, this is the way it was. But if you look real closely at this wall, you start to see that these are 19th century bricks, and even the archway over here to this entrance over here is made from 19th century brick, which makes me think that this was all built after the hurricane of 1831, which then you have to say, well, what was here before? And of course, this wall looks like it was here before too, but as we got underneath it, it just went away. That's sitting right on top of the earth. But what we do have is we have a nice wall here, as indicated here and here in both of these trenches. And and then of course, was that some kind of structure, or was that just a wall here that partitioned the rest of Barbados or the rest of Bridgetown out of the cemetery that y'all are standing in? Well, we do know from the documents that there are houses that were here at one point. So one has to ask, was this a house that extended into what is now the street? And of course, that lays into question how long that street has been here, and what were the original dimensions of the whole synagogue complex. But from between the marl floor and this stone path, stone floor, as we typically call it in archaeology, a stone floor, we have nice 17th century context, meaning that we are only pulling out artifacts that are from 1650 to 1699, if you will, in that time frame. So whatever this is, if this is indeed a building, a living house or a living surface, then it makes you wonder what was here before.
This is kind of like a floor, as Mike said, right? We ain't sure exactly. Looking at how they're together, it looked like a floor, some form of floor.
What these students are doing at the present moment is they are sifting material that was dug out of the trench, and they are recovering and bagging artifacts. This is all controlled. So Althea here, who has this bag of artifacts, would you be kind enough to show them to the camera and take out at least one piece and talk about it? Something interesting. That little piece of Delft, for example. There's a big fragment of Delft here. Okay, hold up that Delft. And you found the pipe as well? And what's that in your hand, Althea?
Okay, this is a pipe stem, clear bowl pipe. This is a partial bowl.
Could you show how it would have looked?
Okay, this would have been the stem. Well, this is not the correct bowl for this stem, so it would have fitted like this with the extended overs.
Yes.
Okay.
And what does this pipe tell us?
Well, besides that, they're very common, which would indicate how often or how popular smoking was. We can use there's a formula you can use on the stems to work out an average year that the pipes were used.
Quite interesting indeed. Dr. Michael Stoner, who was a PhD candidate at the time, conducted research on the compound. He now speaks of the importance of these artifacts.
As you may have already know, there are two houses that we found. One is a 19th century house, and the other is an 18th century house. And we're able to do that we're able to know how old it is by the artifacts. So what we do now is we wash the artifacts, and it's a real important part of the archaeological process, so that we can date exactly what we're doing and when the occupation was exactly. And we found a number of really interesting artifacts. We found one, a metallurgy mold, where apparently the rabbi or the person occupying the house was making their own jewelry out of some kind of precious metal. Now that doesn't mean we found any gold or silver. We'll keep on looking, but we did find a couple of things that they used for that, and more importantly, we found what I consider to be the most important is Barbadian redware. Now, I know that most Barbadians already know that there was ceramics made for the sugar industry and all that, but they also made domestic wares for everyday use. And so we're finding some of that, which is kind of conducive to the history of the Jews in Barbados, because here they were using Barbadian ceramics and integrating to be true Bajans. So.
No doubt, those archaeological digs helped us to understand the past traditions and cultures of our people. Dr. Watson provides us with the history of the district.
But one of the things one must remember is that the appearance of the synagogue and the usage in the yard of the synagogue has changed over time. For example, this roadway here that we see is a relatively recent construction. By that I mean a construction that took place in the first half of the 20th century. This roadway is actually built on existing graves, and the remnants of this wall that we see here would have been raised. There was a very detailed plan drawn in 1806 which would satisfy all our queries, but unfortunately that plan seems to have disappeared. But we do know from the documentary evidence that there were at least 4 houses in here where individuals lived. So the location of the houses is something that needs then to be debated and considered. If we look over to this side, the documentary evidence indicates that the shops that are built here were built after 1850, and they were built on what was termed a graveyard. Now, it is possible that that section might be what was called the Nook, because those Sephardic Jews who, for a number of reasons, fell out of favor with the synagogue committee, were denied burial within the synagogue yard itself and had to be buried outside. There is, for example, a Mrs. Baruch who died in the last decade of the 18th century. And because she had flirted with Christianity, she then, and I have the record for it, she then was refused burial inside the synagogue yard, and the elders of the Jewish church, the synagogue, said she could be buried, but would be buried in the Nook, and that no Jewish attendant or none of the individuals who wash bodies prior to burial would be permitted to wash her body or dig her grave. This also applied to suicides or people accused of some heinous crime. So this yard itself is replete with history, a fascinating history. And the archaeology that we are doing here is recovering aspects of that past that are not reflected in the documents, but which in their own right tell just as compelling a story. To the back of the synagogue, the existing synagogue here, beyond the wall, it's now a car park. But 20 years ago, there was a structure there which should never have been demolished, because I think that the retention of that structure and its interpretation would have impressed itself in the psyche of every Barbadian, because that was the house that for a period of time housed the Assembly of Barbados, the House of Assembly, at a period when emancipation came. And from that house, the Emancipation Act was declared and read. So for a government in the 1980s to have permitted the destruction of that property, that I think should reverberate in the psyche of every Barbadian. Again, I think that was quite unforgivable. I wrote to the then Prime Minister about it, but it was after the deed had been done. And he wrote back to me, basically telling me that I wanted to save everything on the island and that there was no way that that could be done.
In the Jewish religion, a ritual exists where pure and naturally flowing water is used to cleanse the body and the soul of individuals. This ritual is performed underground in what is known as a mikveh. Here in this district, an ancient mikveh which was constructed in the 1650s and covered for more than a century was unearthed in 2009.
At the University of West Indies, students from the history department in their class Historical Archaeology are doing a required excavation, and we're doing this through the aegis of the Jewish community and through two individuals in particular whom I'd like to mention, Mr. Paul Altman and Mrs. Doreen Tabor, who's been a benefactor for the museum that you see here and this excavation on the way. And so these are my students, and it's being led by my doctoral candidate who is doing his PhD at University of the West Indies, Michael Stoner. He's from South Carolina. So what we're doing is we're excavating the area that used to be known as the rabbi's house. This is where the rabbi occupied these quarters from the 17th century on through to a little after the second half of the 19th century. Now, theoretically, we set out just to excavate the foundations of the rabbi's house. And very often in archaeology, luck plays a big role. I mean, we noticed that this had a unusual geometrical appearance, and then there seemed to be some continuation on here. So as we excavated, we discovered this flight of steps leading down here, and another flight going down. And it led to this rectangular area here, and this is known as a mikveh, which is, if you like, a ritual well or an area for ritual baths. And the Sephardic Jewish community who had established themselves here in 1654 would have built this mikveh. We're still going to attempt to date it precisely, but I suspect that unlike the synagogue, which was damaged in the hurricane of 1831 and largely rebuilt on the original footprint of 1654, I suspect that this is the original 1654 mikveh. Now, we haven't finished excavating it yet, but basically a mikveh is a source of natural water. In Talmudic, Hebraic law, water from the heavens. So it was an area that was used to collect rainwater or to be fed from a natural source like a spring. And women in particular, after their menstrual cycle, would come and carry out a ritual cleansing. As I said, men also use mikvahs, not in the degree and the constancy with which Jewish women use them. But, for example, if you had washed a corpse or had been near a dead body, according to the law of the Torah, Old Testament law, you would be defiled, basically. And before you could go to Shabbat service, go into the synagogue to worship, you would have to go through this ritual cleansing. But of course in Judaism there are many, from looking at it from a Christian theological perspective, might think of it as denominations. There were two broad groups, the Sephardim, who were here first, and the present-day community, which is Ashkenazim. And basically the difference between the two is that the Sephardim originated largely from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and the Ashkenazim primarily from Central Europe, Germany, Poland, Romania and Russia, etc. But for both groups, and even if you're Orthodox or conservative, again there are these gradations in the degree to which you adhere to ritual and Talmudic law, halakha, which is what the rabbis will have their congregation espouse. The necessity to have a ritual bath is pretty much required. The mikveh then was used to purify or to cleanse when individuals had either done acts or been in situations in where they were considered to be defiled. So this is a very important find. In fact, the entire thing fits very well into what has been done here, which is the creation of a Jewish museum. And the Barbadian public who may watch this, if they have not yet been to see the museum, it is exceedingly well done, and I highly recommend that they come down and visit the museum and look at this excavation as well, because this will be ongoing for some time, and I can see it as a project that might perhaps last beyond just this one semester. It is part of the teaching process of historical archaeology, and it's been invaluable for the students. They all have been excited and very excited by this find, and I think internationally it'll make the international news as well, because in archaeological terms and in terms of the history of the Jewish community of Barbados, it is an important find.
The first of its kind?
Well, let me tell you this, that in my 16 years of excavating in Bridgetown, since I've been back home, I think this is probably the most exciting thing I've found. And you yourself did archaeology with me, and you know how interesting discipline it is. But no, this is a fascinating find. It is the relocation of the mikveh, because obviously people would have known that the original community would have had a mikveh, but its location until now remain unknown. So, and that's the significance of it.
It's a Jewish ritual bath. My right-hand man, Urban Johnson, he was over here excavating, and he came across a step, and he said, "Hey Mike, I found a step." I'm like, "Okay." So we started following the steps down. We ended up going 13 feet down below the surface, and we found a chamber. And as we excavated it more, we found that what dirt was in there had turned to mud. So we dug a little hole and let the water fill up, put a pump down there, and we just started pumping out the water and taking out the mud, and just kept on going and kept on going. Finally, we hit a tiled bottom. And once we hit that, we cleaned it up, turned off the pump, and the mikveh began to rise up with water again. So it's a natural spring-fed mikveh. After Dr. Watson went to London to look at the archives at Bevis Marks Synagogue in London, and in that he found historical records relating how there was a mikveh here in the 18th century.
I was able to look at the minute books of the elders or Mahamad who controlled the affairs of the synagogue, again revealed much about this ritual bath, and also revealed from their account books that there were some modifications undertaken at different points in time.
The plans for the mikveh turned out to be a nice combination of preservation and conservation. They've taken elements. We've been able to distinguish exactly where the mikveh originally sat, and we actually found the building's foundation. So they're rebuilding most of the building back on those original foundations, and we're even preserving a 19th century floor that was contemporary with the mikveh after it was rebuilt from the hurricane of 1831. It's being it's being rebuilt in a manner to which it will continue to have a ruined look. It will look like a ruin as you come in. It won't have a formal roof as we know it. It'll be hidden from sight, and so it'll still look like an archaeology find, even though it's already been found. And there'll be a nice they've changed the entrance from the original, but it'll be a nice entry into the mikveh where with displays and all, and then it'll be accessible to the public.
This has been a look at the archaeological excavation at the Synagogue Historic District in our capital city of Bridgetown. In our next episode, we will feature the progress made in the redevelopment of this district to the benefit of all. This has been Monuments. I'm Rashid Best. Thanks for your time.